Folks, we just had to break out of the courtroom immediately there because the mother of victim Holly Bobo has collapsed on the witness stand. The judge called for a nurse. The mother said she couldn't breathe. The judge then ordered that the press shut down its coverage of the case, so we cannot see what's going on in the courtroom right now. The mother had just testified that some items that were in her slain daughter's purse were indeed her daughter's. The mother had also gone through a lunch bag that she had prepared for her daughter the day that she went missing. And the mother was saying that it was very hard to look at these items when she was on the stand. And that's when everything fell apart. Julie Rendelman, LawNewz trial analyst, is along with us here to give a sense of what's going on. And it's just been a horrendously difficult testimony on the stand from this mother.
It's so hard to watch. I mean, remember this daughter, her daughter disappeared so long ago, and she's been living with this for so long, and now she's in a court having to look at those items, of which were the items, you know, the lunch she packed for her child, the pocketbook of which she knew all the items that would be in her daughter's purse. So it must be absolutely devastating. I can't even imagine what it'd be like to walk in her shoes.
We had the 911 call and a description of what was going on the morning that this happened. We had a neighbor on the stand earlier today, and it sounds like this whole thing started this September so many years ago with a lot of just mass confusion. There's a neighbor next door who hears a minute and a half of a woman screaming, saying things like stop and don't, and his dogs are going crazy, and he contradicts himself on the witness stand. He says in one breath, well, I just assumed it was somebody she knew, but then saying, well, I thought it was concerning enough that I needed to call someone to try to call the family to see if everything was okay. So It's like, well, which is it, buddy? Is it so concerning that you need to try to reach out to the family, or is it not concerning? He said both.
Right. It's also been a while since the incident happened, and so it's obviously fresher in his mind when it happened than now. And so while these are inconsistencies, I don't know that they amount to inconsistencies indicating that this is a person who's not telling the truth. At the end of the day, he did call someone to say that at the very least it concerned him enough that it raised, you know, I believe he called his mother at one point, who called, you know, Holly's mother. And so obviously, whether it was the biggest deal to them or not, I don't know, but it was clearly enough that he had made a phone call to make sure that everything was okay with her.
Yeah, so this phone tree happens, and one thing that went through my mind is, hey, look, I mean, if I heard a woman scream for a minute and a half, yelling stop, don't, I'd probably be on the phone with 911 while I go investigate and make sure somebody's okay. But and again, I'm not sure who it was, but somebody in the chat room who claimed to be from the area said that's not the way things function in rural Tennessee. People just call their neighbors and call one another. They don't call 911 unless it's like really, really, really serious.
But this does kind of feed in a little bit to the defense's theory that everyone was a suspect, including this guy, because as you just described, if he's not, you know, if he's on the one hand saying one thing and the other hand saying another, and he's not calling the police as you might expect him to do, that might raise the eyebrows of the police officers to start to question him and see if what he's saying is true and whether or not he has anything to do with the crime, which it sounds like they thought he might at some point. So it kind of goes into the defense theory that everyone was a potential suspect in this case.
And if I'm understanding the mother's testimony properly, it sounds like she tried to call 911 when she got word that something was up, because the son said, oh, Holly went off with her boyfriend, but the mother knew the boyfriend was elsewhere and said it couldn't have been the boyfriend. So she tried calling 911 because she's the first one that sensed that something very gravely serious was going on. And so she tries to call 911, and then she gets a hold of 911 in another county or something, and they just said, well, we can't help you. So she has to try to call the other 911, and it's just like, I know even in rural New York, if you call 911, you hit a tower in another county, they transfer you immediately to the other county and you're there. And
keep in mind from her perspective how much, and we all know time is of the essence. Now we know, at least from, you know, hearing from what she said, is that she has a, you know, a son seeing her being basically walking off or being taken by someone who clearly is not her boyfriend, and she wants immediate action, which we know obviously from the husband who, you know, Mr. Bobo, who eventually says, you know, all the cops eventually are all standing outside his front lawn, and he says to them at some point, he's like, if you all think maybe we're involved, that's fine, but can you please go, the rest of you please go out and start looking for my daughter, because people know that if you're going to find someone and find someone alive, you better do it very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, this was the sort of situation that even from the original neighbor's testimony that we started hearing when we came back from lunch, it sounded like it was something that just wasn't right. You know, you got the dogs going nuts, you've got screaming, people being led off into the woods. You know, something just wasn't correct here.
Yeah.
And yet it took probably longer than it should have, or at least from my perspective, for all of the right pieces to come into play.
Yes, it did, and you can understand, at least from law enforcement's perspective, it is a bit odd. It's odd. The brother saying that the sister walked off with someone in camouflage is in and of itself an odd kind of sequence of events. The fact that he thought it was the boyfriend, and then it turns out that the boyfriend was off hunting, you can understand why, at least at the very beginning, law enforcement wasn't sure what to make of what was going on.
So I want to go to clip 12 here. We're waiting to see what's happening in the case, and we're waiting to digest a little bit more of this afternoon's testimony. But just a few minutes ago, the victim's mother collapsed on the witness stand, said she was struggling through some of her daughter's personal effects that were being presented by the prosecution. It resulted in chaos in the courtroom, the judge shutting down the press, calling for medical attention for the mother, and that's where we were left a couple of minutes ago. So I want to listen to the tail end of the defense attorney's opening statement now, and we'll be back with a little bit more analysis of the afternoon's testimony in a minute.
An indictment for homicide. Dylan is then released in August of 2014 to go live with Dennis Benjamin, a man that Dylan Adams does not know. He's not related to Dylan Adams. He's not a friend of Dylan Adams. He is released to go live with Dennis Benjamin. So Dylan goes to live with Dennis, and 5 weeks later, after having lived with Dennis Benjamin, Dennis calls the 911 system and announces over the 911 to the 911 operator, I have somebody at my house who's here wanting to confess to the murder of Holly Bobo and what happened to Holly Bobo. So they bring Dylan in for additional questioning. This time they videotape it. They videotape what's said, and based on what Dylan says at this during this interrogation, they then get their indictment. This is when they get their next indictment, an indictment for the rape, the murder, and the kidnapping of Holly Bobo. And it's after this final session with Dylan Adams that they go ahead and they file their notice of death penalty. So now they have several people charged. They have charged Jason Autry. They go ahead and charge Dylan Adams with rape, murder, and kidnapping of Holly Bobo, and they charge Zach Adams with this. So now they have their indictments and they file their notice of death penalty. Well, turns out that there's some really big problems with this. One of the really big problems is that when they were getting Dylan Adams to do all this confessing, a lot of what he's confessed to doesn't match the physical evidence. After all, when they first start talking to Dylan Adams, they haven't done any searches on the Zach Adams property. Really, Zach Adams has a house that he inherited when his father died. It's right next door to his grandfather's house, and he owns it in part with his brother Dylan. But Dylan lives with the grandfather because Dylan's really not up to living on his own. So he lives, but they all live at the end of the same driveway and in a very close to each other. And so after Dylan begins to talk to them first, while he's still in federal jail awaiting federal charges, they go ahead and they get extensive search warrants to search that property, and a lot of it was even broadcast on TV. They had helicopters out there. And you'll hear testimony in this trial about all of the searches they did. They went through Zach Adams' house and they took over 500 items out of that house. They took all the material off of all the mattresses. They took giant chunks of carpeting out of that house. They took whole pieces of furniture, upholstered chairs, leather couches, all kinds of ottomans and pillows and blankets and shelving. They went in to Zach Adams' house, and in the living room, they cut a hole in the floor that's as big as a car. And they took that floor down to the joists. I mean, you can see dirt. So they took the flooring out. They took the vinyl flooring that was under the wood floor. They took the subflooring out, and they left a hole to the dirt in that house. They took over 500 objects. They brought in backhoes. They searched through Dick Adams's house. They searched some property across the street. They seized, I think they seized 3 cars from the Adams family. 4 cars. They seized 4 cars from the Adams family and went through all the cars. Through everything. They also got all kinds of cell phone, telephone records from them. They had terabytes of discovery in this case to provide, just of all the information that they had. Well, turns out the state has a terrible problem in this case. And their terrible problem is that the story that Dylan Adams has told does not match the physical evidence in the case. Because after they finished going through that whole house, there's no DNA that matches Holly to the house. There are no fingerprints that match Holly to the house or to the cars. There's no hair from Holly that matches Holly to Mr. Adams' house. And the cell phone records don't jive with what it is that Dylan Adams says that day. So now the state, by now there's been an election. Hansel McAdams is out. Matt Stowe has been elected. And then at some point, Matt Stowe has declined or recused himself, and the Memphis District Attorney's Office has been brought in. You know, the Memphis District Attorney's Office didn't start this case, but they've been brought in to finish the case. And so at this point then, the state has a problem. And the problem is they have a story from a man with his special education from school. The story doesn't jive with the evidence, and they are...
That was a brief review of some of the defense's opening statement in the Holly Bobo case, and we are in a holding pattern there because the victim's mother was on the witness stand. She said that it was a struggle for her to go through some of her dead daughter's personal effects. She ultimately broke down on the witness stand. The judge immediately called for medical attention, and then the judge told the media to shut down its live stream. So that's where we stand right now. But Julie, I want to get into some of what we've seen in the opening statements in this case. We just listened to some of the defense. We could also talk about the prosecutor as well, but what are some of your initial impressions of what we heard?
I mean, the specific part you showed was actually one of the better parts to me of her opening. I personally found it a bit, I hate using the word, I always used to use the word discombobulated, but it seemed to be a little all over the place. Now granted, the case is a little all over the place, but you know, as the defense attorney, you want to kind of hit your points and hit them hard and hit them clearly. I think this specific part that she talks about is probably one of her best points, which is that they had, you know, spoken to the brother, gotten a statement from him, and that basically everything he said didn't match what the physical evidence showed, so therefore potentially what he had to say wasn't the truth. And so that certainly is helpful, and I think
that's a perfectly fine tactic.
Exactly.
To turn around and say, well, the statement doesn't fit the evidence, which one do we trust?
Sure, exactly. I just found it a bit confusing, and there were other parts where she was talking about things I admit I couldn't follow her. And I wanted to follow her, and I was having trouble understanding where she was going.
So would you describe describe it, other than discombobulated, would you describe it as rambling? Would you describe it as not having a clear theory? Is it?
I think she does have a clear theory. I think the clear theory is that, that there's no, I think the clear theory is there's absolutely no evidence other than the, as she said, the stolen testimony, because she says basically the only witness who really has anything is the person who is basically facing the death penalty, is no longer facing the death penalty because he is pinning it on her client, and going with the fact that there's no physical evidence. I think all those things are the right theory to go with, and I think she has, a lot to work with regards to that. You just want it a little clearer so the juror knows where they should be looking for the problems.
So we've got that analysis, the defense attorney. Going back into the notes that were taken this morning, I can't see very many, if any, references to reasonable doubt coming out of the openings, and that concerns me.
You mean the wording of reasonable doubt? Yeah, I mean,
placing the burden clearly on the state and saying, hey, look, they charged off after this suspect charged him and then backed out when they heard somebody else's story and said, oh no, we're going to take those charges away. We're going to charge somebody else. And they did it time after time after time. The state can't get its act together, and they're the ones, ladies and gentlemen, who have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that they have it right. Well, their whole case is a mess.
That's the best opening I've seen you do. That was actually quite
Julie,
excellent.
I need to shake your hand.
Thank
Please,
you.
let's
You're
mark
welcome.
this for the future.
But you're right.
We
but
need
you're
that kind of
right.
opening statement out of the defense here, I think.
I absolutely agree with you. But it's kind of when you start to talk about discombobulated, you want it. Yes, and I guess the thing is she has so much to work with, and she's not doing a great job of it. She's covering the bases, and quite honestly, that may be enough. And honestly, she's likable, and we laugh about that, but she is likable. And so I think has a charm to her that the jury's going to like. But again, you want to hit it home, especially in a case like this, where so many things have gone wrong for the prosecution that have impacted kind of who the final person is that's standing before a jury. I mean, quite honestly, the argument could be is that if you had looked at this case a year ago, it would be a completely different guy sitting there standing trial.
Exactly.
So and I absolutely agree with you, but I mean, look, I hate to say this, we're comparing it to other attorneys we've seen, and she's better than some of them.
It's well, look, I mean, I'll probably be skewered for saying this, but in many ways I feel sorry for the defense attorney, because one thing that I read is that she's just got the whole world against her. Mm-hmm. She's defending someone in an extremely high profile, international attention trial in a very small community. And I know that they brought a lot of people in from Memphis to handle it. Well, there's two medium-sized cities in Tennessee, Nashville and Memphis, and beyond that, it's pretty rural, and Nashville and Memphis aren't really that huge in and of themselves. So she's probably the most hated person in that community, and she probably feels that pressure.
Look, I mean, perhaps, and I don't live in a small community. I know certainly, as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney in New York City, there's times when you're disliked for the position you're taking. Although usually people are sensible enough to recognize that it's not the prosecutor, it's the system, and it's not the defense attorney, it's the defense attorney doing their job. And so I find it hard to imagine. And certainly, again, I don't live in a small community like that the community is so out together, especially when you're dealing with a case of which so many pieces are missing and messed up from the prosecution standpoint. If I were the victim's family, the people I'd be the most angry with would be, the prosecutor, because to me, I'd be like, what the heck is all the bungling that has happened all along? So to me, I'm surprised that she's the one that people have the focus of ire towards.
Well, this is just a suspicion, but it's a suspicion based on living part of my life in very rural communities. And, look, we saw this to a degree up in Wisconsin when I covered the Making a Murderer case. The attitude in many, I'm being careful to not say all, small communities is that the police are the good guys and the defendants are the bad guys, and the police are trying to seek justice and the defense attorneys are just trying to prevent justice. And that is the end of the analysis right there. And I'm suspecting, based on some of the other rulings that I've seen in this case, that this defense attorney is just up against a mountain covered by brick walls. Look, I mean, the judge makes a statement that the defendant should just plead guilty and then won't recuse himself for the clear bias.
Right.
So she's got to keep arguing the case in front of a judge who basically admitted bias.
But this is kind of, you talk about making a murder. For all we know, this may be another making a murder, because a lot of times what happens, these small communities have these trials, they end either in a conviction or an acquittal or whatever it is, often a conviction. And then, what happens is people outside of that community start looking at the case and questioning the evidence in the case. And then, for all you know, you'll be handling another case of which your hair might be a little grayer, but just a little grayer.
Yours never grays, Julie.
but
I know you just are the fitting, perfect image of youth.
But it is, but it's true though. Sometimes it takes kind of journalists or people outside the community to call foul, when a conviction happens, and it happens all the time. And who knows if it'll be one of these cases.
Yeah, part of me wonders, because this thing has got a lot of twists and turns. And look, I mean, I'm still looking at this with an open mind because I have not done an extreme amount of background research into it, but I can simultaneously say that even though it seems like a lot of bungling by the investigators, if this truly was some kind of a random thing, or
Sure.
that this was not a close associate of the victims, then the usual suspects are the first people that they would look at. And if this defendant truly did do it, notice I said if, and he wasn't one of the usual suspects, then no wonder it took so long to kind of get there.
Except people were arrested and let go. So there's one thing when you're investigating, a child is missing, you immediately look at the parents or the loved ones or people close to them or people who live close in the community, and you rule them out, and then you move further and further and further. This case is a little different because in this case they actually made arrests, so they believed they had probable cause and a basis to arrest different people that they realized they were wrong later. That's not so good, and that doesn't make you feel very comfortable. However, we have not heard from the main witness in this case. We haven't heard what he has to say. And we haven't heard, we know that there's no DNA and things like that, but we haven't heard whether or not there might be cell phone records that corroborate some of the things he's saying, i.e. his communication with some of the other defendant or defendants involved in this case. And so I think it's a little too early for us to make a real judgment in regards to whether they have the right guy.
I would agree. I will agree with that as well. Look, we're in a holding pattern here, folks, because the mother of the victim, Holly Bobo, her mother collapsed on the witness stand while the prosecutor was bringing forth evidence of Holly's personal effects. It was extremely emotional testimony throughout the afternoon from the mother. I want to listen to the very last thing we saw in court before the judge cut the stream. We're waiting for things to start back up. It may take a while, but let's listen to that one more time.
I'm going to ask that the wallet be passed back to, but not the contents, passed back to Ms. Bobo, and I want you to look in it and tell me if there's a $20 bill where you put one that morning. No, there's nothing in it. Holly have an inhaler? Yes, you did. Did she have asthma? Take just a minute, I'm feeling sick.
Let's take a recess. I want everyone to remain with me while the jury files out, please. Oh. Got a nurse? Got a nurse. Come on. Let's let the jury go ahead and file out. Get some lights, Clark, please.
Watch yourself. Don't move. Come here, Karen. Come here, baby.
Everyone else remain with me, please.
Just a horribly sad situation in court there where the victim's mother broke down on the witness stand. It started, it seems, with the judge giving some instructions, and that's the point where basically she lost it. So you know, the mother's just breaking down, sobbing. Just horrible, a horrible situation. I can't say that I've seen anything quite like that. Maybe you have. You've spent more time in courtrooms than I have. But
I mean, it's always, whether you're the defense or the prosecution, it's almost unbearable to hear a family member talk about the loss of a loved one. I think if you're going to look at this just from a purely, you know, the standpoint of the defense attorney, I mean, you know, they have an uphill battle dealing with a murder case of, you know, this beautiful 20-year-old young woman. But I think, like, on top of everything, when you have the mother in the courtroom, you know, just destroyed by this, I think it makes your job more difficult, because the jury wants to hold someone responsible. And when they want to hold someone responsible, inevitably sometimes it ends up being the person in the courtroom. And so that can bode not too well for the defense. And so it makes it even more difficult.
as a defense attorney, how do you respond to or react to something like this?
I think you, are incredibly respectful to the mother, because you know, you have to be very careful how you cross-examine her in front of the jury. And two, you know, from the start, the one thing the jury has to understand from beginning to end is nobody thinks that this is anything but the most, this is the most tragic event that anyone could go through. She didn't deserve it, all of those things, but that they must separate their emotions from the facts of the case and base their decision only on the facts. And you have to really keep that in their head the entire time, because it's so easy for anyone to let their emotions get the best of them, especially when you're dealing with such a tragedy. Would
it be a wise defense move to not cross-examine the mother?
It depends on whether or not she has something to offer. I mean, it's all well and good to do that, but if you need to get some things from her, I think there's ways to do it that actually will bode even better for you in front of the jury, because you're able to show the jury that you are still doing your job, which a jury should respect. And so, yeah, if there's nothing to ask her, don't create a question for her just because you feel like cross-examining. But if there's important things that need to be asked, which there very well may be, because trying to figure out kind of what went down during those first moments of which Holly went missing are important, and she has some information to give. So I think, obviously it's more about the way you question her and not about the actual questions.
Where could the defense go with this, other than to try to dive a little bit further into the confusion of the various 911 calls? And even then, is it really do anything to help the defendant?
Well, it depends. So, even we talk about the original guy who heard the screams, even if we're talking about timing, there might be something that in certain ways leads a jury to question the initial person who heard the yelling. There might be some that leads the jury to question kind of the son, because I think, the son was a suspect as well. And so anytime you kind of open the jury's eyes to the possibility that someone did it that is not the defendant on trial, I think you have to pursue it.
Another piece of information coming out of the courtroom this afternoon is there's a freelance journalist that apparently has been banned from the proceedings for, in the court's opinion, identifying a juror in a tweet. Now, let me back up a little bit and explain what this may or may not mean, and I'm going to be extremely careful. I have read the purported tweet that is the purported offending tweet, and it does not seem to me to identify the juror. There is no name given, there is no age, there is no address. It doesn't say anything that, in my opinion, goes beyond what I have seen other reporters report about jurors, just sort of basic information in almost every other trial. But this isn't a small community, and maybe the judge feels that saying even a little bit is too much, that it could lead to the identification of a juror. So that issue also popped up in court this afternoon. It was a freelance journalist, and that's all I'll say about that. I'm not going to say anything else. I'm not going to read the tweet, because apparently the judge felt that it went too far. But this raises another question, Julie, is, certainly we don't want jurors identified. It's in the rules not to identify jurors, but then what makes an identification?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see the tweet. So I don't know what he described, and quite honestly, I don't know the purpose of him describing kind of the juror, or the specific juror. It is a small community, so while in a large community, if I describe someone as either African American or Caucasian, that's not really going to tell you anything. But if I'm making a description of an individual in this small community, it might make it much easier for the community to know who we're talking about. The judge seems pretty strict and pretty, I guess, prickly. He doesn't want it, and he's not going to have it. And so, I guess everyone's going to have to be pretty careful about what they write.
Yeah, so, well, that's another thing that's happened this afternoon that everybody's trying to deal with. So I want to dial back as we wait to see if trial's going to come back into session here in the Holly Bobo case. We don't know how long this is going to go on because the mother of the victim collapsed on the stand not too long ago, as perhaps you saw here on the LawNewz network. We are also hearing that the defense is making a motion for a mistrial, which is not necessarily a big surprise.
Yeah, I assume there's going to be many motion for a mistrial made. They are not going to get a mistrial based on what happened. All the judge needs to do is basically give the instruction that he should always be giving the jury, which is, this is an emotional case. You're going to hear from people who are extremely emotional. You must be able to separate your emotions from the evidence that you hear. And if you can't do that, you can't sit as a juror, which I assume all the jurors said they can, and so they're going to move on from this.
So we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of the afternoon, right after lunch, for this case in Tennessee, where the neighbor of the victim was on the stand talking about what was going on when he heard screams that morning. Let's listen in. Well, actually, we'll start that in a second if we get a chance. Because it looks like they're starting to come back into session in Tennessee. We're waiting to see things pick up. We're going to see if we've got a new witness on the stand or if the mother was able to sort of bring herself back into composure here. So a couple of different possibilities coming in. We're listening in. Let's go back into court now in Tennessee.
Defense counsel indicated that they wanted a jury out. I'd be glad to hear anything.
Zachary Adams, at this point, we would ask to make a motion for this trial. I'd like the record to reflect that at the time that Miss Bobo was being cross-examined, Miss Nichols was at the...
She wasn't being cross-examined, direct
examination. She was being handed certain items, very personal items. And at that time, apparently, Karen Bobo suffered a panic attack. She passed out in front of the jury. She required medical attention. And under these facts, I think it's going to be impossible for her to get a fair trial, for Mr. Adams to get a fair trial from an impartial jury. I think they're so tainted at this point that the proceedings should be stopped and a new jury should be called.
All right, let me say this. The witness was within 5 feet of the court. She first started, she said words to the effect that she was not feeling well. Before I could get a recess called, and we had a little problem I was trying to solve media-wise, that I'd almost called a recess. I dealt with that during the recess. But before I could get a recess called, she in fact had a medical event, and she passed out cold. This chair is fixed, so they had some difficulties extricating her. The jury was in passing or filing out the door at that time. This was clearly a medical event. There's no question. This was not something fake to gain sympathy. This lady had a medical issue. Had a couple of, a nurse came up immediately, thank you, whoever that was. And then they've had paramedics on call. The sheriff has been, he's had them here arranged since day one. They won't give us an ambulance, but they will give us paramedics close. They have dealt with her. They feel that she's ready to go now. They said extremely low blood pressure when they first started, as I understand, very rapid heartbeat, the types of things that are consistent with syncopic events. okay? And I know because I've had them, and they're no fun. But this was not something that was done in an effort to achieve any type of sympathy or anything. If you want me to, I'll instruct the jury that they are not to give any sympathy whatsoever because of the fact that Ms. Bobo apparently had a medical event, but your motion for mistrial goes through.
Yeah, Your Honor.
Do you want me to instruct them to that?
Yes, Your Honor, I would ask for it. And also, Your Honor, after they finish their direct examination, we would like, of course, to have an opportunity to cross-examination because of the medical event. We would ask that we have a recess until in the morning to begin our cross-examination.
I'm not going to do that. I will continue to watch. Basically, the paramedics have given me the thumb.
Okay, folks, we're waiting for the jury to come back in here. The defense just made a motion for a mistrial because of what the judge ultimately referred to as the mother's medical event. The defense not wanting the jury poisoned or biased by this. The defense going so far as to seeking some cross-examination and a recess until the morning. And Julie, you just looked and said they're not going to get that. And of course, they're not going to.
No, and nor do I think it would be a very smart move on the part of them to potentially cross-examine this woman and somehow intimate that she's faking it. I don't think that's the approach to take.
And I think they almost wanted to, if I heard it properly, they were also asking to sort of like examine the attending paramedics who had attended to her.
Correct. Which, by the way, that's their prerogative to do. She is a witness on the stand. Again, I don't know where that's going to get them. I guess the argument could be made is if they were able to prove that she faked it, then somehow that would be a basis for a mistrial. But even the individuals that treated her, I don't know how they would be able to prove that she was faking it. I mean, she had already indicated to the judge she didn't feel well. To me, quite honestly, I don't even know. She may have fainted, but she also sounded, based on everything, she was hysterically screaming, talking about, looking at the things that remain of her child, which I don't know how any mother could sit through what she just sat through.
Well, the judge wasn't having it out of the defense on this one, so the judges are just basically saying, hey, look, it was on the record that she wasn't feeling well. The judge said she passed out cold. Well, it happened right next to the judge, so I guess the judge is in just as good of a position as anybody to be a witness to it. Said that it was, quote, not faked to gain sympathy, that it was a legitimate medical event, and that when immediately examined, the paramedic said her blood pressure was extremely low. So that's on the record at this point. We know what happened. And again, our hearts have to go out to family members of victims in situations like this.
And by the way, as a defense attorney, I don't want her coming back another day so the jury sees her again. I want her to get on the stand and get off the stand and be done. So the last thing I want is to keep this going any longer, where she has the potential to kind of break down again in front of the jury on a second day. So they just need to put her on the stand, get it done, and move on.
Yeah, so, the defense is taking every liberty it can here because this is a death penalty trial.
Absolutely. And so, just so we're clear, anything I'm saying, they should be doing. They should be raising an issue of mistrial. They should be raising an issue of speaking to the attending EMS, emergency services. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's going to amount to much.
Yeah, it looks like they're going to bring the jury back in. The people in the gallery are standing up again. So let's listen back into the Holly Bobo case out of Tennessee.